hundreds of years, God directly led his people, and yet they never fully followed him. Finally, they rejected him altogether as their leader. They asked God for a king to lead them. They wanted to be like all the other nations around them. They wanted to be just like everybody else. Saul was Israel's first king, and he started out well enough, but unfortunately he didn't fully follow the ways of God. Soon the kingdom would be taken away from him. Israel was about to have a new king. Who would be the new leader for Israel? Would he be different than Saul? Would he follow after God? How would Israel do under his leadership? Once again, God would use Samuel to anoint the new king. The last time he did this, he was led to Saul, the one who stood a head taller than everybody else. He certainly looked like a king. I wonder what Samuel would find this time. Where would you go if you were in charge of finding the next king for a nation? Would you go to Wall Street, the universities, a military academy? Well, God didn't have any of those places on his mind. He came to a place like this. You see, when God would choose the next king of Israel, he totally changed the standard of what it would mean to find someone who would be willing to serve him. Samuel enjoyed a close relationship with God, and it was because of this relationship that God could use Samuel to find the next king. Samuel was instructed to go to Bethlehem, and there he would find Jesse. It was one of Jesse's sons that would be anointed as the new king of Israel. Imagine the joy Samuel felt as he arrived in Bethlehem. This was the day that God would show him the new king in Israel. Imagine the pride he had when Jesse brought his first son before him. This certainly must be the king. But imagine the confusion Samuel had when one by one Jesse's sons were brought to him, and each time God said, "Nope, he's not the one either." God had given Samuel some insight into the process of selecting the next king, but it didn't seem to be doing Samuel any good. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." God sees the heart. But what good did that do Samuel? After going through this 7 times, Samuel must have really wondered what was going on. Obviously, Samuel couldn't see into the heart like God could as he looked at Jesse's sons. "Is this all of them?" Samuel asked. Jesse told him there was one more, but he was out in the field taking care of the sheep. "Well, we might as well wait for him too," Samuel said. So they waited around until the youngest one arrived. I wonder what Samuel was thinking at this point. He had already seen 7 of Jesse's sons, and all of them looked like king material. Now everything was riding on the youngest, and he was coming in from tending the sheep. Maybe Samuel had misunderstood God's instructions. Maybe it wasn't Bethlehem. Maybe it wasn't Jesse. But as soon as David arrives, God says to Samuel, "He is the one." So he sent him and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." What was Samuel thinking now? What do you think when God moves in ways that we don't quite expect? How do you make sense of things when God's ways just are hard to understand? In selecting David as the new king, God set up a new standard in judging the character of those that are around us. No longer would external issues be sufficient. Issues like resumes or qualifications or the way people look. God's standard would be very different. It would be something much deeper. And after he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, concerning whom he also testified and said, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will." God says it's about the heart, and that works for God because he can see the real you. He can see beyond the surface to who you really are. But the truth is, others can get a glimpse into your heart as well. That's because our actions, the way we live, are rooted in the issues of our heart.
The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of his heart, his mouth speaks.
Although Samuel had anointed David as king, David did not become king right away. David didn't become king until he was 30 years old. So what did he do during the 15 or so years in between? Well, actually, David became a servant of the current king, King Saul. David went back and forth between tending his family's sheep and serving King Saul. During one of his trips home, David's father asked him to go check and see how his brothers were doing. They were fighting on behalf of Israel against the Philistines, one of Israel's continual enemies. When David arrived at the front line, he saw an incredible sight.